Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's CECAN webinar, the Pluralistic Evaluation Framework for Policy Evaluation. My name is Lisa Fletcher. I'm one of the 3 CECAN Centre Managers. For those of you who haven't joined a CECAN webinar before, CECAN stands for the Centre of Evaluation Across the Nexus. We are a research centre funded by a group of research councils, government departments and agencies. Our aim is to test and promote innovative evaluation methods that take into account and are appropriate for the complexity of the world around us. We are in particular looking at nexus issues, the interlinked areas of food, energy, water and environment. If you want to find more about our activities, please visit our website www.cecan.ac.uk. Today's webinar will be presented by Richard Gunton, who is one of our current CECAN Research Fellows. Richard will talk to us for around 45 minutes and answer questions at the end. Please submit your questions at any point during the webinar for Richard via the question box in the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel. Today's webinar will be recorded and will shortly be made available via our CECAN website. Thank you for your participation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm hoping people can hear me, and I am starting my slideshow, so let's check if this technology is working. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for your interest in this pluralistic evaluation framework, which I'm going to try to explain and show how it can be useful for a wide range of evaluation and other policy-related activities. I'm going to talk, as Lisa said, for about 45 minutes. And then there should be time for some questions, comments at the end. I hope you've also received an email from Lisa this morning with a few questions that I would very much appreciate if you could look at and respond to. Thanks to a few of you who've already sent some responses. I shall mention as we go through the webinar this afternoon the particular points where it'd be helpful for you to think about further responses if you have time. That would be helpful to me because I'm trying to gather some data about the actual concerns and priorities of people interested in policy evaluation. And I hope it will also be helpful to you thinking about what this might mean in your own areas of interest. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to go through a little bit about the importance of values in evaluation and the very concept of making values explicit in what we do, and then a little bit of the background theory that's informed my approach. And then I'll explain the pluralistic evaluation framework, which has 3 pillars. I'll give an example of how it might be applied to a particular policy scenario, and then some comments on how it could be taken further according to different different uses and interests that people might be working on. Then there's a final short example about how you could use the same framework for textual analysis of a particular government policy document. And finally, I'll summarize and show a take-home template, which I hope will be helpful. I should say at this stage that I'm very grateful to my CECAN mentors, Adam Hainovich, Sue Hartley and Ian Christie, as well as to a number of other people who've had some input to this work, including Andrew Basden, David Hansen, Elena Van Asperen and some others. So on now to values and goods. My focus area has been environmental policy. And so the examples I'm giving are mostly concerned with arable, agricultural, terrestrial, environmental type policy areas. So if we ask what kinds of goods do policies seek, it's not hard to find that there are value-laden terms in some of the policy summaries that are used. So for example, the Rural Development Plan for England network on its website mentions that the RDPE's aims include making England's agriculture and forestry sectors more competitive, improving the quality of life in rural areas, and diversifying rural economies. And I hope you've can agree with me that those are all quite value-laden terms. There's the particular word improve in there, which shows us it's clearly talking about making things better. And then another example from the government's 25-year environment plan. In the introduction, it says the aim is to leave our environment in a better state than we found it, to help the natural world regain and retain good health, to deliver cleaner air and water in our cities and rural landscapes, to protect threatened species and provide richer wildlife habitats. So a very diverse set of aims there, which involve making the world a better place in general terms. And this is the first thing that I'd like us to think about in our own situations. So we actually ran a few workshops, one in London and one in York, where we asked people to think about how a particular policy area might seek to make the world a better place. So if we start making values explicit, the term good is the most general value word. It just means, well, it's hard to define, it just means good. And there are other words like improved and enhanced and desirable and optimal, which also don't really make things very explicit as to what kind of goodness we want. Those are all broadly synonyms for better or good. So the first question that was emailed in the message that I hope you received this morning was just to ask if you would think about, in whatever your area of interest is, what kinds of goodness policies ought to seek, or what kinds of betterment you're interested in. And if you haven't had a look at that, I'd be grateful if sometime during the webinar or afterwards, if you could just dig out that email, and you'll find that there's a question there, question 1, asking if you would kindly list just a few terms which come to mind before we go through the rest of this webinar, where I'm going to suggest some kinds of goodness that we might aim for. And just jot down some words in an email and send it off to me at some stage after the webinar, following the instructions. I'd be very grateful, thank you. So we did this exercise in workshops, as I said, in London and in York, and people came up with a range of ideas. Words came up, all sorts of words came up, and ideas, health, resilience, robustness, transcendental values, things to do with the meaning of life, all sorts of huge diversity of ideas. And of course, that's very natural. There are all sorts of kinds of goodness that our policies might aim for, either explicitly or implicitly. The theoretical framework and background that I'm building on here, I'm going to lay it out in the next couple of slides. It's a fairly intricate framework that derives from a philosophy that was developed in the Netherlands in the mid-20th century, particularly by philosophers Herman Dooyeweerd and Dirk Vollenhoven. And they suggested that the whole of reality functions in 15 different kinds of aspects, 15 different ways, which are listed across the bottom of this slide. And I'm just going to quickly run through them, and then I'll go through them a bit more slowly in a few minutes' time, and then we'll show how they might be useful for thinking about values. So very broadly speaking, they say there's a kind of numeric way of functioning in the world, and we have a subject in universities, mathematics, which especially focuses on that. There's a spatial kind of existence in the world. There are shapes and there are locations, and we have a branch of maths, again, geometry, that looks at that. There's movement, kinetic aspect, things move. There's the physical aspect concerning energy and matter and mass. And of course, the subject of physics focuses on the physical analysis of a situation. There is the biotic aspect, which concerns life. And the green rectangle here is a note that plants function, especially in the biotic aspect, as well as, of course, being physical things with shapes and numbers and movement. They suggested a psychological aspect or a sensory aspect concerning sensations, which all kinds of animals have, but broadly speaking, plants don't have sensations in the same way. And the science of psychology especially looks at that. And the words in capitals here represent some kinds of values that start to be associated with these aspects. Healthiness in the biotic aspect and comfort in the sensory aspect. Then they suggested that in order to understand how humans function in this world, we have to recognize we have an analytical aspect. We function by making distinctions and contrasts, and we do logic. There's some kind of formative aspect. We have a concern with doing new things and making history, innovation, doing what hasn't been done before. And perhaps this is a distinctively human activity to some extent. There's an aesthetic aspect where we're concerned with beauty and harmony, and there's then an aspect to do with symbolism and language, where we represent things using signs and symbols and language. Very importantly, of course, there's a social aspect for humans, where we are concerned with respect and social dynamics, group dynamics, and social structures and relationships. There's an economic aspect concerned with efficiency and how we use resources and what we prioritize and how we optimize things. Then coming to the end, there's a jural aspect concerned with justice, what's fair, what's due to different people, what people deserve, and not just people, of course, what other species might deserve. There's an ethical aspect, these philosophers suggested, concerned with going beyond justice to what's generous, altruistic, loving. And finally, something that we might call the ultimate aspect concerns convictions and identity, and in some cases religion and faith, and what is trustworthy. So that's a sort of general map of meaning. I'm going to try and show that that's useful for what we're talking about. But first, here's another part of the theoretical framework, so just bear with me, if you will. This is a slide where the spectrum, the rainbow-coloured spectrum in the middle, represents that diversity of aspects, of ways of functioning in this world, which we, I hope, all feel familiar with. And then on the left, near the left, there's a grey spot, which represents individual things in this world. They can be people, but they can also be animals, they can be rocks, they can be rivers, they can be particular places. And these things, when we think of them as humans, we tend to assign some kind of value to them. And so they become goods, or evils indeed, which we value to different extents. We prioritize some species over others, perhaps. We have preferences in our own lives for how we treat different people. And we assign value to all sorts of objects in our possession. So the left-hand side of the slide represents goods and things and processes. And that's a more general concept that I'm going to come back to in a minute. In the middle of the slide is a rainbow spectrum representing different ways of appreciating goods or processes, diverse kinds of value that we can attribute to situations and things and people and so on, ranging from, at the bottom, some kind of basic biological way of valuing things, the things that keep us alive, which we don't have much choice about how we value. We need our food and we consider it a good thing if it's good for us, for example. But following through that spectrum, which we're going to unpack in a few more minutes, takes us all the way through to much more abstract kinds of goodness, which are not necessary just to keep us alive. You might start thinking here of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're familiar with that. And so this central part of the slide represents how we have attitudes of valuing things, and those influence our actions and our ethics. And when we talk about the values that people hold, we're often talking about how they prioritize different kinds of valuing, whether they tend to hold values that are perhaps very people-focused or very economically focused, very frugal, or very biologically focused, or whatever. And the right-hand part of the slide here represents stakeholders, and the way that we need to think about a diverse range of stakeholders in order to have a policy that's going to be democratically accountable and fair in some sense. So that's the general framework. I'm going to say a little bit more about these aspects and start to suggest how they do or don't relate to valuing, and also to the kinds of systems and processes that our policies might try to influence. And then I'll tie it all together and show how the pluralistic evaluation framework takes account of these. So I'm going to run through those 15 functional aspects of reality and hope that this is a useful background. So starting at the top, there's this numerical aspect concerned with quantity. How much of things, how many are there, singular, plural? This isn't obviously related to value, so we won't talk about value with regard to the numeric aspect. And the second one is the spatial aspect, to do with extension, space, shapes, proximities. Well, are things near? Are they connected, and so on? Again, it's not easy to see how values relate to that, so we won't worry about that. The third one, the kinetic aspect, also is a very sort of basic mathematical type of aspect about movement and change over time. Are things static or dynamic? So those three are not particularly related to values. They are relevant to all kinds of systems. So if you're interested in an ecosystem or the geology of a particular area or the climate of the world, then basic physical science is all about quantifying things considering spatial relations and distances and movements. So that's the three basic mathematical aspects. Then ones, I group them together and call them broadly ecological aspects because they concern physical stuff, biotic stuff, and sensory functions. So the physical aspect is concerned with energy, matter, other things like texture and temperature. And there are some systems, of course, we can easily think of which are fundamentally physical, perhaps world climate, the water cycle, geological processes. I put in square brackets natural capital because I'm trying to relate this to other popular frameworks, and natural capital will include physical systems. Again, this one isn't really value laden in any obvious way, but the biotic aspect, which concerns life and living processes, plants and animals and humans and so on, are things edible? Are they infectious? Are they disease-ridden? Are they healthy for us, and so on? There are, of course, obvious systems and processes which our policies might target here. The biosphere, most broadly, and ecosystems, which could be local. Again, that's typically part of natural capital. In some ways, it can also concern human capital. And now values are obviously important because as human animals, we're very concerned with whether things are healthy for us or not, whether they're going to preserve our life or kill us. The third aspect about sensory functioning, feeling, whether things are pleasant, stimulating, fun, basically concerning our five senses, is relevant to systems when we think about dynamics of people's mental health and pleasure and these sorts of things, which might also be included in human capital. So the values attached to the sensory aspect are often to do with comfort or displeasure. The next slide, the next three aspects, I grouped them and called them cognitive because they are fairly distinctively human, I think, although other animals may use them. The analytic aspect concerns distinction and logic, diversity, uniqueness. And in our age, the advent of powerful computers and artificial intelligence is an important kind of system that runs on logic, essentially, and is of great interest and concern to some areas of policy. But the basic values concerned with functioning analytically are whether things are logical or illogical, whether they're distinct or confused. Very basic aspect, which is fundamental to doing science. The formative aspect is about what's new and also about what's historic. It's about things that are unique in time and differentiation as we separate out and make distinctions and create new bodies of knowledge and also new artifacts. We develop things. We also educate ourselves and form ourselves in new ways. So there's a kind of value associated with basic progress and innovation. The aesthetic aspect, I hope, is very intuitive, concerns harmony and beauty. Perhaps there's a sort of system of fashion, how fashions change as people change their views of what's beautiful. Let's move on now to these next aspects, which are called communal. The symbolic aspect or lingual aspect is to do with how we use signs and symbols to refer to things that they're not. We use characters and letters to refer to objects in the world. So we can consider whether a particular document or piece of writing or speech is clear or informative. And there are these systems of language and recording which develop over time as we try to record things better. The social aspect, again, is I think very intuitive and concerns interactions between people generally. We have values to do with whether things are welcoming. Situations can be welcoming, people can be respectful or not. There can be deference, appropriate relationships. And so the obvious basic system of society and its life, the life of communities, is often important for policy making. We can ask whether a person or a situation is sociable. And the economic aspect, again, fairly intuitive, I think, concerns resources and not wasting things, using things frugally, optimizing things, prioritizing wisely. And so we have plenty of systems in our world very familiar to us concerned with the economic aspect, business, trade, the economy. And we can ask the basic question, is this situation efficient? Is this policy efficient? Is this an efficient use of money, for example, or time? The final three aspects I've called ideological. They go beyond basic social community life. The dual aspect is about what's just and fair, what people deserve, what should be attributed to people on the principle of justice. And so we have our civil society and also our developing legislation, which tries to increase fairness and justice in society. We can ask whether things are equitable. The ethical aspect goes beyond what's strictly due to express love and generosity, or even sacrifice. And family life, for many of us, I hope, expresses love and shows the importance of making sacrifices and going beyond what is strictly justice. And of course, that's a very important part of our society, that there are dynamics of care and volunteering in communities. So we can ask whether something is loving or altruistic or sacrificial. And the final aspect is sometimes difficult to name, partly because it means such different things to different people. It concerns ultimate commitment and where we find our identity. So it includes religion, but not just religion, all sorts of ideologies by which we live, which guide our decision making. So we might recognize dynamics of aspiration in communities. Some communities perhaps have a more positive kind of aspiration. So those are the aspects, and that's basically the theoretical section of this. Now I'm going to try and show how these can be a useful way of thinking about policies and systems that we might be working on. So the pluralistic evaluation framework has three pillars: stakeholders, processes, and values. And it's basically ways of brainstorming and thinking about categories of stakeholders that we ought to consider and types of processes or systems in the world that our policy might target, and the kinds of values that our stakeholders might hold concerning processes and systems that we're interested in. So I'm going to run through each of these in turn and suggest that that spectrum of aspects can be a useful way of helping us to consider a full comprehensive range of each of these three pillars. So the idea is perhaps not all 15 aspects apply across all of those three pillars, and this slide shows how it seems useful to apply them. So basically the lowest aspects, as they are now on this table, the numerical sort of mathematical aspects, are useful for thinking about stakeholders, but not so much perhaps for thinking about process and values, although you may disagree, you may find them useful there as well. But the higher aspects seem to be more useful across all three pillars. So what might that look like as we think about real situations. Think of stakeholders first. I've listed again those aspects, and I've suggested some functional groups of stakeholders that we might want to consider when we're planning or evaluating any policy. And the key thing here is that these are functional groups of stakeholders. So a particular person might function in all sorts of different ways. A particular person can be concerned with any or all of these aspects. So we're not asking how we can divide up the population into these different groups. Instead, it's a way of thinking about how we can recognize interest groups and functional groups that ought to be consulted in their capacities as groups interested in a particular thing. So perhaps, well, if we start at the top this time with the ultimate aspect, there are, of course, religious groups, and there are other kinds of cultural groups that have a very wide range of concerns, but are focused on meaning and what makes life worthwhile. And in some policy areas, at least, perhaps many, there might be important representatives to consider from those kinds of groups. Going down, the ethical aspect is a lot about love and volunteering and the things that people do out of generosity. So there are often important volunteer groups to consider consulting, or NGOs. In the jural aspect, there are people whose business is to think about justice, people in government, campaigners as well, and policymakers ourselves. In the economic aspect, we should think about business leaders, business representatives, and people whose livelihoods are at stake in whatever we're thinking about. Socially, there are communities that we can recognize, local communities that have a life of their own. Symbolically, we might think that journalists, but also politicians, are concerned with representing things, with communicating, with reputation, what a place or a situation means to other people and places. Aesthetically, there are people whose business is to be concerned with what's beautiful, perhaps amateur arts groups, and also tourists and the whole tourism industry. The formative aspect here in the middle of the list is very general. It's all about what's new and people's interest in creating new things and preserving unique things that were new from the past. So historians, but also educators who seek to inculcate new abilities and appreciation in children and adults. That's a very broad category, I think. Analytically, perhaps the sorts of people who are especially concerned with making distinctions and analyses are scientists. And scientific community often has strong views on particular policy areas. Going down to the sensory aspect, again, we might think of mental health care providers as a group of stakeholders particularly concerned with the sensory aspect, and also general healthcare providers too. Biotic aspect in our society is perhaps not so obviously important to specific groups of people. Farmers and gardeners are certainly concerned with biotic functions of places. In other societies, nomads are the people that ought to be considered here. But of course, we all depend on the living world in all sorts of ways. So in some sense, we're all in that category. Physically, we might think that there are people whose particular concern is with the physical structure and function of land or the sea, resource managers. Then the mathematical aspects at the bottom there are perhaps best used for thinking about other categories of people, such as people who move and people who don't, residents and commuters, people who are fixed and people who move. Spatially, whether we are going to try and consult stakeholders from localities or from people who are dispersed around the country, for example. And numerically, there's the basic distinction between consulting individuals and groups. And that's just a very basic use of the numerical aspect. And the right-hand column shows a few other groups of stakeholders that perhaps don't fit so easily into this scheme. And of course, they need to be considered where appropriate. But I hope that this list of aspects might be a helpful way of filling in some gaps in our coverage, recognizing blind spots. Second pillar of the pluralistic evaluation framework concerns processes. Here, the it seems to me, at least, that the mathematical aspects at the bottom are not so useful in their own right, because the sorts of processes that happen in this world are all at least physical. So let's start at the bottom this time. Hydrology, hydrological processes, geology, perhaps if your policy is concerned with fracking, climate change is a feature that many policies need to be concerned with. Those are broadly physical systems. Biotically, we are concerned often with ecosystems in the biosphere. Sensory terms, we're concerned sometimes with mental health and other aspects of health that come from our sensations, hay fever and disruption to people's lives. Analytically, if there are systems that are themselves analytical, perhaps artificial intelligence is quite a useful one to think of here, and computational processes. Some of these aspects may be more useful than others. Formatively, we think about the general processes of development and innovation in our society or in an area of technology. Some things are done for the sake of progress, for the sake of innovation, and also that process of educating individual people so that they become richer, more cultured people than they were. And then aesthetically, there is the general area of fashion, which shouldn't be ignored, especially in conservation policy. People consider what's really desirable to protect. Symbolically, there are the processes of language and record keeping. Social processes, very important. Economic processes, I think, are obviously a key feature of our policy making and evaluation. Jural or justice processes can have a life of their own, and we can be concerned about their development. Family life and dynamics of care might need considering in all sorts of policy areas where we might not have thought of them. And finally, religion or developments of religious processes and dynamics of people's search for meaning in life. And so to the third pillar of values, and this is perhaps where the pluralistic evaluation framework is most distinctive, in suggesting that, at least from that biotic aspect upwards, there are important kinds of values which are different from each other, which our policy should consider. And the key argument here is that we shouldn't be satisfied with collapsing all these values into a single category. So we shouldn't say, according to the pluralistic evaluation framework, let's convert everything to monetary terms and effectively consider it all to be economic. It may be possible to put monetary value on all kinds of goods that people look for in different systems, but the suggestion here is that we should resist that, because if we do so, we will have lost some fundamental kinds of goodness and values that actually do matter to real stakeholders, real people. So starting at the bottom again, I'll just run through these briefly because I think I mentioned them before now. We might be concerned with what is health-giving and safe. That often has fundamental importance, but that has priority. If something is dangerous, then that can overrule all of the other kinds of goodness. In sensory terms, less often prioritized, but we may want to consider what's comfortable, pleasant, or even fun. In analytical terms, there's some goodness recognized in distinctiveness, diversity. Biodiversity perhaps comes in this category. We're often interested in maximizing numbers of species or biodiversity for its own sake, even if it might mean the death of some individual animals. We might have to cull one species because we actually are more concerned with biodiversity than with the biotic life of particular individual animals in some cases. There's diversity of other things too, of course, that we often value. There's the desire to have what is progressive, to be innovative, and also to conserve things that are unique. There's certainly value in the beautiful. The right-hand column here I'll just mention is some more classic kinds of values that are associated with these aspects. Wilderness value, for example. Symbolically, there's value in things being informative, clear, significant, meaningful. Socially, we're concerned with having societies that are sociable and perhaps situations that are welcoming to outsiders. There's economic value, concerned with efficiency and also sustainability. sustainable prosperity. There's justice and concern with what's fair and equitable. There's ethical value. We have values where we we love things, and we seek situations that we will love and devote ourselves to, and hope that our children will as well. And there's a sense of ultimate value applied to situations, perhaps particular sacred places or systems that mean a lot to people. I'm just going to pause here and ask if you would keep in mind the email of questions that was sent round by Lisa this morning, because I've asked you, if you have time, to think about each of those three pillars in terms of your own area of policy interest. And if you could think about just one category of stakeholder who is important, and then some of the kinds of processes and systems that that stakeholder might be interested in, which your policy might seek to influence. And finally, the kinds of goodness or values that those stakeholders might be concerned with. To try and help you along the way, I'm going to now run through some examples. Worked example. This is inspired by one of the workshops we had, one of the discussion groups who thought about the case of coastal realignment policy. So this is, as I'm sure you know, about adjusting the boundaries of the land and the sea in places, especially on the east of England, for example, where land is sinking gradually, and the sea tends to move inland, or coastal defences have to be reinforced. And it's a very interesting area of policy because it affects a wide range of stakeholders and brings up a lot of values. So here's how we might, just as a sketch, think about that policy area in terms of the three pillars of the pluralistic evaluation framework. This slide is about stakeholders, and as you'll see, I haven't managed to fill in all of the categories, and I think that's quite natural, but it's good to think about each of them, and to see whether there are people we ought to be consulting who have functions in this list that we haven't thought of. Perhaps I won't run through these, reading them out, but it may be interesting to look at how we might apply these aspects to categories of stakeholders who might have particular interests here. Again, do keep in mind that any particular person could come into any or all of these communities, so this is not about separating society into different categories. This is about recognizing the kinds of spokespeople or representatives that we ought to consult. Then the next stage, ideally, of course, is to do a consultation, and in many policy situations that is done. But if we were just to carry this armchair exercise, we might think about kinds of systems and processes that some of our stakeholders might be interested in, all the way through from the obvious physical processes at the bottom of the tidal dynamics, which have to be modelled and predicted. The photo at the bottom, incidentally, comes from the Tollesbury Coastal Realignment project, which I believe was the first in the UK of its kind, experimenting with breaching a small section of sea wall and allowing fields to be flooded when the tide came in. There are a lot of biotic processes which are going to be influenced by this kind of policy, local ecosystems, both the marine ones and the ones that were formerly terrestrial. Moving up, we can certainly think of aesthetic processes concerned with tourism and the perception of the landscape as more or less beautiful. We can think symbolically, perhaps, about this situation, the dynamics of reputation. Perhaps Tollesbury and the other sites nearby have become famous in some ways, at least in some circles, for this experiment, which may be good or bad for the local community. We can think about the community life itself and how that might be affected by the policy. We can think about economics, and certainly property price is an obvious feature of the economic processes concerned. And it might be that the whole process of carrying out the coastal realignment has quite a major effect on local communities' political life as people engage with a consultation. And I'm sure we could fill in some of these other categories here. And then thirdly and finally, to think of the kinds of values that stakeholders may hold, the kinds of goodness that people might be concerned about. And here we only start with the biotic aspect. We go up through the 11 aspects, the biotic at the bottom up to the ultimate aspect at the top here. And here's a set of ways for each of the aspects that people might appreciate the policy or be unhappy with it, according to their judgment on its effects on those different systems and processes. So, yes, I hope that may also help you to think of some relevant categories and kinds of goodness for the couple of questions that I put in that questionnaire. Again, I'd be grateful if you have time to send me some thoughts about that after the webinar. So to take this further, moving into the final few slides now, we might think about using this pluralistic evaluation framework in a range of ways. So one obvious way that it can be extended beyond that very simple armchair exercise that I've just shown is to think about different scenarios. And of course, policies may have to take account of different possible outcomes and also different exogenous scenarios, world events or climatic events, for example. And in each of those cases, it might be important to consider which stakeholders would be affected, which systems and processes need to be considered, what side effects or unwanted effects there might be of the policy, and then to do the final pillar of considering stakeholders' appreciation, their assessment of value in each scenario. Another way that the pluralistic evaluation framework ought to be continued is to consider how stakeholders themselves, like all of us, are able to integrate across these kinds of goodness in order to give a vote for or against. So although the list of values is not supposed to be collapsed into any single value, it's not supposed to be possible to consider them all as a kinds of efficiency in economic monetary terms, nor indeed are you supposed to add them all up in terms of biological survival. We're not doing an evolutionary experiment here to see survival of the fittest. But of course, as individuals, we are able to look at all the pros and cons across such different diverse aspects of value and arrive at a decision. So it might be important to consider each category of stakeholders and how they might do that evaluation and summary vote. And if possible, of course, actually to go out and consult and find out what people think. Thirdly, it's important to have a way of integrating expert insight, because as I've laid it out so far, the pluralistic evaluation framework is a lot about consulting stakeholders in a very democratic, equitable kind of way. But we also need to bring in to bear expert insight and find ways of doing that. The whole second pillar of this framework about systems and processes has been quite well explored in the area of systems mapping, where both in a democratic way and also by bringing in expert and scientific witnesses, it's possible to think carefully about the likely impacts of a policy on particular systems. So scientists and other sort of specialists or connoisseurs have their own values which they attribute. So if your policy is going to endanger some rare species of insect, it might be that only a small number of people care about that, but their concerns often need to be brought into consideration, even disproportionately to the number of people who hold them. So the take-home message here is that the pluralistic evaluation framework itself doesn't give a recipe for adding numbers up and getting an ultimate policy recommendation or evaluative summary. It recognizes that decisions and evaluations ultimately call for judgment. And so step 2 here says we ought to consider individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders' summary judgments. We ought also to recognize that at the end of the day, we elect our government, our policy makers, our politicians, one way or another, to do these kinds of summary for us. And it may be that some of you listening are more in that category of having to make the judgments. So this is a call to resist the urge to look for some scientific calculation to give the answer. So according to what kind of evaluation or policy area you're working in, it might be that this pluralistic evaluation framework can be combined in different ways with other tools. So at the stage of policy design or appraisal and impact assessment before the policy is implemented, then scenario planning is important, and it might be especially useful to use process tracing models or systems maps in conjunction with a pluralistic evaluation framework, suggesting which kinds of processes need to be emphasized. While the policy is in progress, monitoring, of course, needs carrying out, and the pluralistic evaluation framework can suggest categories that ought to be considered in the monitoring using appropriate indicators. And finally, for evaluation after a policy has been implemented for a while, the PEF suggests kinds of criteria that ought to be considered when other quantitative methodologies are used. So it is a framework. It's not a tool that competes with some of the existing tools. But I'm going to do one final example here to try and show how useful it can be. The government's 25-year plan, published earlier this year, lays out an inspiring vision for the future of the countryside and of the UK's terrestrial and marine environments. And I've tried to use the suite of aspects of the PEF to look at its emphases in terms of what kinds of values it promotes. So this is just a preliminary attempt with very basic textual analysis, where I simply basically totted up the numbers of occurrences of different value-laden words and phrases in the whole document. And it was a somewhat arbitrary decision as to what was a value-laden word or phrase, but you'll see a lot of them on the next slide. And then I grouped them into these different aspects in order to see which were best represented, which kinds of aspects were best represented. So, this was at the bottom here. This starts with a physical aspect, actually, and there are certain kinds of terms there which concern physical processes and systems, and you can see they figure quite prominently. Next up, that's in the red. Next up, in the kind of brown, are biotic terms. And basically the size and boldness of each term here indicates its frequency of use in the document. So there's certainly a lot of consideration of biotic processes and systems and kinds of goodness, as you might expect. In the sensitive aspect, I could only identify these three terms: mental health, enjoy, and human health, which might be considered broadly sensory and concerned with sensory values. The analytical aspect, to do with analysis and science and so on, biodiversity came up a lot of times. But moving up, the formative aspect, develop, is broadly a formative word, perhaps a bit too broadly. But that was, I think, one of the most frequent terms in the whole document. Strategy, progress, heritage, and so on, innovative. The aesthetic aspect, arguably, litter is an aesthetic evil, although it has other aspects too, of course. And that was represented a bit. Social aspect, partnership, and encourage were big words. But moving up in the top set of blue words, as you see, the economical aspect is extremely dominant in the document, if we allow that terms like sustainable are economic in a very broad sense. So it's not all about money, of course. A lot of terms there. The dual aspect, there are a few terms to do with justice. The ethical aspect over on the right there in brown, there were just a few words concerned with that: voluntary, care, philanthropic, and things that might be to do with the ultimate aspect of conviction and commitment. There were a few of those terms. I'm hoping to do a more sophisticated version of this analysis soon, but that's as far as I've got for now, and I hope that shows what might be done by applying this kind of filter. So here's a summary. Pluralistic evaluation framework takes complex policy situations and seeks to use these 15 aspects of functioning in reality to help us identify and consider different kinds of stakeholders, different kinds of processes and the kinds of values that those stakeholders may hold. That's basically what I have to share with you now, and I'll be glad for any comments or questions that people want to type into this interface in the last 10 minutes or so. I want to acknowledge these people who helped me, my mentors there on the left, and a couple of other people who've also given helpful ideas, and the people on the right there who were involved in an earlier project that fed into. After the webinar finishes, I'll be grateful if you're able to send me an email with a few of those thoughts that I was saying about stakeholders and processes and kinds of goodness that might be relevant to you. And I hope you will then also receive a slide looking something like this, which is a kind of summary slide that might be useful for taking the framework further, and a link for further information at the bottom. So thanks very much for your time and attention, and do please ask questions and stay in touch if you're interested to follow how we develop this idea. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. I see we've had 2 questions posted. Are you able to view those if you click on the questions tab?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
But before you answer them, can you read them out so that for the benefit of those who are going to be listening to the audio recording? Thank you.
My panel so that I can see them properly. Thank you. Yeah, so I hear a question that says, how do you describe the difference of value and valuing? So I think this goes right to the heart of the framework for thinking about values. And indeed, it is quite an area with a bit of confusion of terms, I think. So the way I think about it, and the way this framework suggests, is that valuing is a function that humans, and possibly other species too, have. We value things in different ways, and in that way we ascribe values to things. So we have the active process of valuing things, which means that we end up attributing value to things. So we can ask, is this is this a good tree? That's not a very easy question to answer until we know what kind of goodness we're asking about. But if I'm concerned with gathering food that might fall off a tree, then I can start to say, well, yes, this is a good tree for providing food. So the tree's goodness is difficult to attribute until I recognize the different kinds of ways in which I might value it. I hope that's helpful for that one. Now, here I have a question which says, I'm a bit confused by how you selected value-laden terms in the last example. Could you say a bit more about that? They seem to be a mixed bag. Yes, indeed, and I would like to find a more objective way to do it. Yeah, but basically it was done by looking through the list and trying to recognize terms in the document which have some sort of connotation of either good or bad in the context. But certainly there's a lot of ambiguity there because there are terms, I mean, develop, is one of those terms that broadly, perhaps vaguely carry goodness. It's good to develop things. Of course, it can be used in negative ways too, that, disease develops or a problem develops. So there are limitations with doing textual analysis itself, just because you need context, really. And I only used a bag of words approach. So I think I'll just say for now that that's something I want to develop. I'd be grateful for suggestions or advice, but we have started consulting some linguists to see if we can do better. There's a question.
Hi, Richard. Sorry to interrupt. Your sound keeps fading in and out, and so can I just check that your connection is that you're connected in your headset and that things are close to you, because you do keep fading in and out. I've had a message from someone who's lost the audio sound, so if you could just check that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I'll try and speak slowly and clearly as well. So yes, a brief answer to that last question was just to say that we could do a lot better, I think, in thinking of how to recognise value-laden terms, and really we should move beyond a bag of words approach, which ignores the context of each word, because it's only when we read the whole sentence that we appreciate whether something actually carries a positive or negative term. There is a question here that says, do you think that valuation of ecosystem services for environmental land management schemes has had this effect you mentioned of removing values other than the economic one? Yes, that's a key driver of this project in some ways. It grew out of a critique of the ecosystem services framework. First of all, of course, I've appreciated greatly the ecosystem services framework for helping to isolate different kinds of services that natural places provide for different people. Our concern, our critique, was that it tends not to be so explicit about stakeholders. A service is assumed to be a service full stop, whereas in fact something like I don't know, the hydrological effect of a woodland on a slope might be positive to the people who live downstream, but it might be negative to the landowners who were farming the slope and now have woodland there. Just that sort of thing, which of course can be dealt with. But there is a tendency in that framework to collapse things, first of all, to a single sort of ideal service user stakeholder, and then to be able to convert them to monetary terms. So from my perspective, that is a liability of the ecosystem services framework, although it can be used carefully to try and avoid that. I have a question here, if I still have time, which says, can you say a little more about how the 15 different aspects are refracted in each other? E.g., a mountain is a physical and spatial construction, but it can also have an ultimate aspect attributed, such as being the domain of gods in certain cosmologies. What that may mean for thinking about the impacts of policies more broadly. Big question, yes. So, yes, well, one thought we have here is that sometimes some of the aspects of a particular stakeholder will shed light on others. Or what I mean is that how people value things in one of those higher aspects, such as the ultimate aspect or perhaps the ethical one, once we appreciate what their values are, what their priorities are religiously, for example, or ideologically, then it makes more sense what their attitude is towards things in some of the other aspects. So there is actually, yes, interesting relationships between these aspects, and they come in a certain order, which is supposed to reflect how people, how people's judgments in lower aspects tend to be influenced by their judgments in higher aspects. I think that needs working out a bit more to make it practical, but that's what I might say about that one for now. Somebody has asked, can you talk a bit about how this might help with conflicting values, not just between the different aspects, but even within them, where the notion of what is better might be different for different groups and different vantage points? Yes, I think it's... so one point to make is that even resolving these different kinds of aspects doesn't necessarily go far enough. Something can be healthy in one respect, of the biotic aspect, but also damaging in another respect. So a certain kind of natural food, I suppose, can have both positive aspects, giving you calories, for example, and negative aspects of giving you a nutrient imbalance. So this isn't necessarily the stopping point for those analyses. And the question of recognizing conflicts between different stakeholders, again, resolving stakeholders by these aspects for their primary interests won't necessarily get you all the way to avoiding conflicts. Again, there are people with different kinds of economic interests in the same situation, people who stand to lose, to profit, and others who stand to lose by the same action. So again, this is a template which needs to point further. I think that's what I can say at this stage. Do I have time for?
Yeah, one more question. Yeah, I think there's one there from Tom.
I wonder if this is it. Someone says, I wonder if you had any reflections related to applying this framework in policy practice. You mentioned using processes that involve multiple stakeholders. My concern would be that if you wanted to use the framework in a participative way, you would need to spend an extensive amount of time agreeing definitions and ensuring understanding amongst the stakeholder group to ensure buy-in to any recommendations. This would, of course, be on top of or alongside developing policy itself. Yes. Yes. I think as I presented it so far, I hope that the framework has made some intuitive sense to people, but I would certainly be the first to admit it might not be ready to take onto the streets in a survey. Part of that may simply be about improving presentation and definitions, but I think more of it is about how it needs to be unpacked by us as people working on policy in order to work out which people to talk to, what questions to ask them, and how to interpret complex answers. So that's something that, again, is work in progress, and that's a challenge of using this tool for each specific situation. I should really mention that we are working to implement a pilot of the tool in one or two different areas, but so far we haven't had the funding or the time to do that. So this is largely still held up as a tool for others to use and perhaps to help us to implement. And that's another reason why I'm keen to have comments and feedback from people, email as well. So I think we've reached 2 o'clock. Thank you very much, those who've asked questions and those who haven't, for listening and participating. And I'll hand back to Lisa now. Thanks very much for your time.
Yes, thank you everyone for listening and participating. I will send you an email when the recording is available to view on our website, and also Richard's PowerPoint presentation. And I will also include in the email the link to this slide that Richard would like you to think about for your future work. Thank you.